It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Come on in. We've got the holiday season about, big news everywhere, an impeachment proceeding that's underway, another Democratic presidential debate that's coming up, a lot of politics. We've had we had Ron Placone on the podcast, a comedian with the Jimmy Dore Show. I hope you enjoyed that. He's a progressive that I really like. And, of course, I'm coming at the world from a progressive point of view. And the one thing that I would point out, I think one of the biggest news stories of the decade, if maybe not the modern era almost, is this Washington Post article on the Afghanistan war with pretty complete evidence, somewhat like the Pentagon Papers, that, yeah, we've been lied to about war again for at least 3 administrations, for at least 2 decades, that the people behind all of this were either too dumb or they were in on it. To quote my favorite line from the movie Casino, check it out. The significance of that article can't be underestimated. It should be dominating the news cycle, this particular story, but it's not, because of the impeachment proceedings. And, I'm lukewarm on that. As we've discussed on the podcast before with the good Dr. Stephen Schmidt from Iowa State University, the impeachment proceedings are largely political. They're going to get him in the House, it looks pretty much like, and they're not going to convict him in the Senate. We need to get on with that and get it behind us. I've been saying that all along, and I saw some really clear evidence of it here just recently in the USA Today polling. I don't know if you caught that or not. The good news is 48% of Americans think that Trump should be impeached and removed from office. Well, 47% say no. And you can look at that and say, well, okay, more do than don't. But the point of that is, when you look at other national polling that has to do with Trump and his dumb policies and programs and things he says and does, usually it's like 47, 48% opposed to Trump, and then there's his base, and they come in there at about, 35%, something like that. That's where that, I'd call them the lunatic fringe, the hardcore Trumpies are. They're about 35%. Well, okay, where did that 47% come from? Where is that other 12% that thinks that Trump shouldn't be impeached, that this is off base? Where are those folks coming from? I'm worried about that. That's a major concern. We need to get the impeachment proceedings behind us if they're not going to have him convicted in the Senate, and get along to nominating a candidate that can defeat him in November 2020, because it's not happening right now. The other polling of alarm was the fact that Trump leads all Democratic contenders right now, all announced candidates in the field. He's come, and this is during the impeachment hearings. Trump, for the first time, trumps all of his opponents. So anyway, those are the 2 big issues of the day, the Afghan war thing, and I talk about that a lot. I'm behind a candidate named Tulsi Gabbard or Bernie Sanders that, Bernie's big on domestic issues. Tulsi's really big on the war. I want my government to keep me safe. I want to keep us from being blown up here in the next couple of minutes by ballistic missiles or something, because we've ticked off nuclear powers around the world. I also am always talking about on the podcast about another looming issue, a crisis that's going to kill us all if we don't find a way to deal with it, and it's the climate crisis. If the nuclear missiles don't get us tomorrow, the climate crisis could get us the day after, and maybe it already has. I don't know. The climate scientists don't have a definite timetable for this kind of thing, but that brings us to today's guest, and I want to thank him for his patience, for listening to the open, and for coming on the show. This guy's name is Basav Sen. He's with the Institute for Policy Studies as the Climate Justice Project Director. In February 2017, he joined them, and his work focuses on climate solutions at the national, state, and local level that addresses racial, economic, gender, and other forms of inequality. And Basav had an op-ed piece, a column that appeared in the national newspapers and the USA Today this past week, and it was talking about, and I just got to start this. I want to read this, Basav. It's great. Your open was wonderful. A sinister rogue state poses a clear and present danger to humanity. In fact, an opportunity for the international community to stand up to the scofflaw nation just opened this past week. Now, this rogue state, he says, isn't Iran, Venezuela, or any other country the United States foreign policy and establishment typically demonizes. So I saw that and I thought, okay, Vasav, you got to be talking about Russia, right? It's got to be Russia. That's the rogue state. Russians are everywhere. That's all I've been reading and hearing about in the news. I've been checking under my bed every night for Russians. I haven't found any yet, by the way. But if it's a dangerous rogue state, it's got to be Russia, right?
The rogue state, let's say, is one that's completely dominated by Exxon and Chevron and BP and Shell.
Yeah.
And that rogue state is the United States.
Yes.
And just to elaborate on that a little bit, like you were saying, climate change is a clear and present danger to humanity, and it's already affecting wide swaths of the planet, including right here, where you are in the Midwest. Farmers are contending with floods that have been having a severe impact on agricultural production. Out west in California, they have these crazy 1 in 500 years wildfires twice a year. On the Gulf Coast and in the Caribbean, in places like Puerto Rico, they have been similarly hit with 500-year storms twice a year. And the climate crisis is already upon us. And yet we have the US government openly denying the clear evidence of not just science, but people's daily lives. And not only are they walking out of multilateral efforts to tackle climate change, like the Paris Climate Accord, and not only are they censoring the work of government scientists, but the US sort of stands out apart from the rest of the world in the degree to which we are growing our production of coal and oil and gas at precisely the time when the world scientists are telling us we should be scaling back production. And just to give you a sense of how outrageous the numbers are, 3 out of 4 or 3/4 of the growth in global oil and gas production over the next several years is going to come from the United States. And what that tells me is that the US government really cares more about the profits of a handful of fossil fuel companies than they do about your life and mine. Your job, my health, they're all, secondary to the profits of Exxon and Chevron and Shell when it comes to the view of the US government. And I would also point out it's the US government. This isn't Trump. This is unfortunately bipartisan, and the surge in US domestic oil and gas production can be traced right back to the Obama administration and its policies.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a critical point to make here. Everybody, of course, is dogpiling on Trump with good reason here. I mean, the first 3 years of his administration has been a disaster, particularly when it comes to the climate crisis, taking us out of those Paris Climate Accords and so on. But this goes back to Barack Obama. Now, I don't give Obama a pass on a lot of things, but some of this stuff, including the banking issue and all that, I look at it and say the guy took office in 2006 or 8, whenever it was, and we were a door knock away from a Great Depression. It was definitely a Great Recession. And so the only pass that I would give him is maybe he didn't want to upset the apple cart. Maybe he wanted to get things righted economically. Maybe that was very short-sighted. I think maybe it was. Before anything was done about these other issues, including oil and gas and drilling and Exxon and all of these heinous problems afflicting the planet. Do you give him a pass on any of that?
No, unfortunately, I don't. And here's why. Actually, responding to climate change in a way that also addresses social and economic injustice and inequality is actually good for the economy. you will create lots of jobs in the transition away from extractive, harmful industries like oil and gas to renewable energy, including distributed and community-owned renewable energy, and energy efficient buildings that benefit lower income communities and save them bills, which is something God knows they critically need to save on. So you're providing a huge economic boost. You're bringing direct economic benefits to people and creating a very large number of, I should point out, a very large number of not outsourceable and labor intensive jobs. Because retrofitting buildings for energy efficiency or putting up solar panels just requires a lot of hands to work. It's not like a contemporary oil refinery where you have a really small number of workers and high degree of automation and technology, and really you have a handful of jobs. And so it would have been an opportunity for a major economic transition and a lot of job creation if done right. And I'm underlining if done right because there are ways to do it wrong. There are ways to do a transition like that wrong that just concentrates power and economic opportunity in a very few hands. But if you do it in a way that intentionally distributes the benefits, then you can create a lot of jobs, and it would have been a tremendous economic boost to the country coming out of the recession if the Obama administration had prioritized a publicly funded, what we call just transition.
I mentioned it when we started. You're the director of the Climate Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, and I want to read the rest of this kind of listing of bona fides before I pose the next question because it's a big one. It says, prior to joining the IPS, Basav worked for about 11 years as a strategic corporate campaign researcher at the United Food and Commercial Workers. He's also had experience as a campaigner on the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and global finance and trade issues. And as a member of a grassroots neighborhood-based environmental group, he has been involved in local struggles on energy justice in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, you're a great man in my book. You're doing great works out there. So here's the question, and I kind of got the gist of this from your most recent column, but the climate crisis scares the bejabbers out of me because, as I said, the climate scientists always say they're being conservative. It could be much worse. It could happen, the calamity, worldwide much quicker than what they've said. Do you believe that there's still time and there's still the ability to work to get our way out of this?
The optimistic answer that I can give you, and I am an optimist, is that unfortunately we may have locked in some harmful effects, which we are seeing today already. And that even if we were to cut down emissions drastically today, we will be left with even worse effects than what we are seeing today. But that said, we cannot afford not to tackle this issue because if we don't, it will be exponentially much worse with literally hundreds of millions of people across the world starving for no fault of their own. And just for every reason, for practical reasons, for ethical reasons, we cannot ignore this crisis and we have to act on it with urgency.
Well said. And let's take your advice to heart. Let's get something done here. And maybe, as we discussed at the beginning, it has to do with changing our politics here in the United States and the people leading the country to get something done and get this addressed. One final question. Do you believe that the U.S. should really be sanctioned, or was that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, or is there any sanction that could be imposed against the United States that would help speed this process along, get us to the table, get the United States to take the leadership role that it should have when it comes to climate change?
Well, it was not entirely tongue-in-cheek. It was intended to spark discussion. It doesn't mean that I believe or have any, practical reason to think that in the next 6 months, we are going to see meaningful sanctions against the US. And not to mention, I hope that it doesn't have to come to that, because it will be a heavy lift. And with any sanctions, there always are unintended harmful effects. And certainly, we don't want sanctions on the US that end up hurting the most vulnerable people here. We don't want low-wage workers and struggling farmers and unemployed folks and people like that paying the price for the recklessness of the fossil fuel companies. But if we can find a way to do very targeted sanctions that hurt specific big corporate institutions, whether it's the oil and gas companies or the big banks who provide them with financing, or the big insurance companies who provide them with insurance coverage. Because one thing about the climate wrecking fossil fuel companies is they would not be able to function without Wall Street. Wall Street is who enables them. And then there's the big tech companies like Amazon, who provide their computing power to oil and gas companies to crunch the huge volumes of data they need to crunch to figure out about where it makes the most sense for them to drill for oil. So there are all kinds of players in big corporations who enable the oil and gas industry to grow and to function. So if there's some way to target sanctions at these bad corporate actors and make sure that regular folks are not impacted, or at least minimally impacted by it, then that is something to consider. And it's a tool that we should not rule out from our toolbox.
Yeah, I like that. And as you mentioned, sanctions always seem to affect the civilian population and the least among them. But if you can do it minimally, maybe just enough to get folks' attention, because there's going to have to be a groundswell amongst the people also. And if they can see this as being real, maybe they'll do what they need to do to get this done. And I'm glad you mentioned Amazon too, by the way. They share their computing power. I'll tell you somebody else they share power with, subject for another podcast, the CIA. Yeah. Amazon shares its computing power with the CIA, folks. Anyway, that's going to do it for today's podcast, and I really appreciate him coming on and talking more at length about this great column, this article that he wrote that was in the USA Today. That's Basav Sen, and he directs the Climate Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Now, you can follow him on Twitter. If you like what you've heard and you want to hear and see more of what Basav has to say, just check him out at the hashtag BasavIPS. But for right now, that's going to do it. We encourage everybody to check out Podcast by George, too. We're on Twitter. We're also on YouTube and Spotify and all of the platforms where you can get podcasts. Right now, that's another podcast by George.